Sabéis que hemos dado la comunidad virtual, sabéis que el profesor Wortham trabaja en la Graduate School of Education de la Universidad de Pennsylvania. Él ha realizado muchas investigaciones de carácter fundamentalmente interdisciplinar, en el campo de la antropología, de la lingüística, de educación y también de psicología. Es editor o miembro del consejo editorial de revistas de mucho prestigio, como y otras muchas. Y ha publicado también muchos libros sobre análisis de discurso y temas relacionados. Yo destacaría básicamente 3 libros que a mí me han impactado especialmente. Uno es Análisis in Action del 2001, y otro es Learning Identity, que creo que es del 2006, y muy recientemente el Scores Analysis, Beyond Speech Event, que es justamente, digamos, el tema del seminario con el que vamos a trabajar con él hoy y el jueves. Entonces, para nosotros realmente es un placer y un honor, que no es la primera vez que viene, es la segunda, y esperamos que no sea la última vez que nos con nosotros. Él entiende bastante el español, o sea que no retengáis por preguntas y cuando queráis preguntar algo, si tiene alguna dificultad entre todos ya lo resolveremos, pero no dejéis de preguntar porque no dominéis el inglés. Y nada más. Hasta la próxima. Thank you for sharing with us your approach to the
Gracias a profesor para invitarme y a ustedes para venir. Hablo español un poquito, pero es difícil para mí explicar sobre temas académicos en español porque no tengo vocabulario. Y por eso, sí, pregúntenme en español, está bien, y si necesito ayuda, pedir ayuda, pero en la mayoría de la clase voy a hablar en inglés. Pero antes quiero conocerles un poquito, su nombre, su escuela, su puesto, su tema, sus intereses. Corto, solamente un poquito, pero sería bueno para mí entender un poquito de ustedes. ¿Okay?
We want to know more about your methodology. We have higher expectations about what you would tell us.
Bueno, César.
Mi nombre es David, trabajo en el tema de identidad de aprendiz, que es psicóloga Mariana y mi director de tesis es César. Y el tema del análisis del discurso me parece fundamental avanzar en estrategias, en técnicas, en teoría, en relacionamiento. Y tengo bastantes expectativas con el taller que vamos a tener hoy y después.
Hola, soy Tatiana López. Trabajo en las ayudas educativas que ofrecen los tutores para el análisis de las prácticas de los estudiantes. Mi tutor se llama Rosa y en verdad que creo que es muy enriquecedor poder ampliar la mirada metodológica del análisis del discurso.
Mi lector es César y bueno, con muchas ganas de aprender sobre lo que tú nos vienes a presentar del análisis del discurso.
Hola, soy Yesenia, vengo de Costa Rica. Estoy aquí realizando una estancia doctoral, soy profesora de matemática y realizo estudios en interacción en los procesos de enseñanza y aprendizaje de la matemática en educación secundaria.
Hola, buenos días con todas y todos. Soy David de Ecuador y la semana anterior hace 2 semanas escuché la tesis de la doctora Mariana. Y me interesé por el discurso, así, ese es el motivo por el que estoy acá.
Hi, I am also David. I work in action research through service learning. My director is Stanton Wortham, and we are studying identity change of the students implicated through their ethnographic narratives. So the analysis of discourse is quite necessary.
Hi, my name is Shamali. I'm doing the PhD here in the University of Barcelona with César Cola and Engel. And my thesis is about how the educational technology will help the collaborative processes, but my interest about discourse analysis is since 5 years ago, maybe. That's the reason because I'm here.
Hola, soy Iris. Estoy estudiando, estoy empezando el doctorado aquí con César y con Ana. Y estoy haciendo un doctorado sobre personalización del aprendizaje. Y además trabajo con ellos en los proyectos de investigación y por eso el tema del análisis del discurso me será muy útil para analizar los datos.
Yo soy Antonio, soy estudiante de máster y también estoy colaborando con el grupo de César en los análisis de los proyectos y por eso me interesa este tema.
Hi, my name is Constanza. I'm doing the PhD here at the University of Barcelona with Professor Marzo García Milá. My research is about confirmation bias in the use of evidence and argumentation, so I'm doing kind of analysis of discourse, but it's not a linguistic one, it's not different kinds, so that's why I'm here and I'm here.
Hi, I'm Laszlo. I'm doing my PhD in the University of Girona, and I'm studying also working on learning identity. I'm particularly interested in gender issues and moral implications of the speech, and that's why I'm here. Thank you.
I am Emma Martin. I am Professor of Educational Psychology at the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. I have been the supervisor of the thesis of Mariana Solari. Perhaps you know something about her, and she's going to explain in more details on our interest because the approach is very close to our own positions about identity.
I am Mariana Solari, we knew some years ago. I have finished my doctoral dissertation a few months ago, and the principal aim was to study the configuration of the professional identity of a school psychologist, novice school psychologist. And well, I'm here because, among other circumstances, I would like to continue learning about your way of doing discourse analysis and this cross, this cross scale and cross events. Sorry, the cross events study of discourse analysis.
Hello, my name is Daniel. I'm doing my doctoral thesis on the process of reflection between teachers. So specifically how they construct representation and how this representation evolved along time. And the process of interaction between teachers during the process of reflection. I use discourse analysis.
My name is Ana. Soy profesora de la Facultad de Psicología y también pertenezco al equipo de César. Y todos los trabajos que estamos realizando en este momento estamos muy interesados en su propuesta de análisis del discurso.
Hola, soy Darwin Díaz. Me acompaña en el proceso intereses en la formación de profesores, pero desde los ambientes personales de aprendizaje. Me acompañan en este proceso Ana y el profesor César, y como muy interesado en el análisis del discurso, sobre todo desde la perspectiva de la lingüística antropológica, me llamó mucho la atención. Pues muy a la expectativa. Chicas, thank you very much.
Gracias. So first, an overview of what we'll do in the 2 days. Tell me if I'm talking too fast. When I get excited, I talk fast. So this stuff is exciting to me, so I talk fast. So even people who, English speakers, tell me to slow down, so you can tell me to slow down, okay? So first, today, we will focus on how to analyze one event. Something that happens in a few minutes or a half an hour. One event, a discrete or separate event. And then on Thursday, we'll study how do you analyze patterns that happen across events. So those are the 2 topics. Within events today, across events on Thursday. And today, I'll try to work you through a systematic procedure for going at one event. And I have 2 examples that we can use, both in English. The first one I translated into Spanish, so I have the English and the Spanish on the handout. And then the second one is just in English. And then we also have some data from the project that you all are doing, an interview with a teacher. And I hope we'll have time at the end where we can break into groups and you can work on that interview. The interview originally was in Catalan, but they translated it in Spanish, so they have it in Spanish. And it will probably be easier and more fun for you to work on a piece of data in Spanish. So I hope that we have time to break into groups and we'll apply the techniques that I talk about to those data at the end today. And then on Thursday, we'll pick up with, we'll start with one example, but then we'll connect that example across events and talk about how that process works of doing cross events. So that's the plan for what we'll do. Okay so far? Everybody understands what I'm saying? I'm okay? So today we have, I did the first 2 in Spanish. So discourse analysis is about connecting patterns of linguistic signs, words, grammatical categories, pronunciation, any kind of sign that comes out in what people say. It connects patterns of linguistic signs to social actions of various sorts. So in order to do discourse analysis, you have to show that there's a pattern in the usage of the signs, some kind of pattern, repetition of certain sorts of things, signs that consistently presuppose or point to the same sort of pattern or identity. You have to show a pattern in the use of the signs, and then you have to connect it to some sort of social action that people are engaged in. You can do this at various different levels. So language always does 3 kinds of things. Whenever we use language, we always do 3 things at once. We describe something. So anytime you speak, you say something. You refer to something in the world. The weather is nice. I'm talking about the weather. So you always describe something. You refer and predicate. You pick something out in the world, and you say something about it. The weather is nice. That's the first thing language always does. Language always establishes relationships. Every time you speak, you establish some sort of relationship with whoever you're talking to. So if I tell you the weather is nice, you're going to ask yourself, why is he telling me that? Who does he think I am? I can tell the weather is nice. Why does he have to tell me the weather is nice? I already know that. So you're asking yourself, why is he talking to me this way? And it could be because I don't know what else to say to you, I don't know you. It could be because I'm trying to make a friend, I want you to be my friend, and this is the way I'm starting to talk to you. There are various reasons why I might be telling you this, but anytime you speak, you always create some kind of relationship between yourself and the person you're talking to. The third thing language always does is it always connects to other language. Language always comes in packages. So we don't say one thing at a time. Computer. And then we go on. We always say things, they come in clauses, they come in narratives or paragraphs, they come in conversations. So language always comes together with other language. And language always points to or connects to the other language that comes around it. So if I say the weather is nice, then I also said other things before that, or I'll say other things after that. And you have to study, how does that one thing we're looking at, the weather is nice, how does it connect to the other things I said before and afterwards? So language always does three things. It describes something, it establishes a relationship, and it connects to other language, always, anytime you say anything. And discourse analysis can study any one of those three things. So it can study how it is that you describe things, and how you establish relationships, and how it connects to other things. So you look systematically at how language describes things, and you try to figure out how does that connect to a social action of some kind or another. So in English we say, if you're sitting at a table eating, we say, can you pass the salt? Can you pass the salt is a question. So grammatically, it's a question. But it's not really a question, right? Can you pass the salt means, give me the salt. I'm being polite, but give me the salt. And if you don't give it to me, I'll eventually say, just shut up and give me the salt, right? But I normally say, can you give me the salt? Because it's more polite to ask it as a question. A second language speaker who doesn't know English well often doesn't understand that. So if you say, can you pass the salt? They're likely to say, yes. Why are you asking me whether I can pass the salt? Anybody can pass the salt, right? So that's a misunderstanding that happens with someone who doesn't speak English very well. And it has to do with how language describes things. It's a grammatical category, a grammatical rule that can you pass the salt is a question in English. But we can study systematically, look at people who have just learned English or are just learning English, and we can study when do they make mistakes about misunderstanding. This pattern is called implicature. It's where you say one thing, but you really mean another. And somebody's supposed to understand that it's not a question, it's a request. And you can study second language speakers, second language learners, and see how often do they get that wrong, and see what are the consequences in a conversation with native speakers. So a discourse analysis would follow those kinds of questions. Every time you see a question like that isn't really a question, you would write it down and you would analyze what happened with the second language speaker. So you can do discourse analysis about the way that language describes things, the way grammar works, the way that semantics work. You can study that systematically and attach it to a pattern like how do second language speakers misunderstand and perhaps get labeled or characterized as unintelligent or something because of the way that they don't understand that pattern. Language also establishes relationships. One obvious way it does it is through what linguists call deictics. We call them pronouns in folk speech. So pronouns like we and they. We means, in English, the speaker plus at least one other person. So the definition of we, grammatically, is it picks out the speaker plus one other person. But it could be everybody in the human race. It could be all 7 billion of us, could be we, or it could be just me and one other person. And so if you can figure out who we is, sometimes it gives you information about the political views or the social position of the speaker. So if I say we, me and Mariana really understand all this, and I mean just her and me, I'm implying that all the rest of you don't understand it. Or me and Mariana know why Donald Trump is the best candidate for president, and the rest of you are just crazy because you don't understand why it is that Donald Trump is great. So if I use we that way, and you all know that I mean just the two of us, I'm separating us from you. I'm drawing a line in between us and you. And in English, they is often the other side. So if I'm talking about we, I could turn to her and say, Mariana, they don't understand what they're talking about. They're pretty stupid. And then I'm drawing a line, and I'm saying we are good and you are bad. So that pronoun is very important, because the pronoun, it refers to something, it describes a group of people, so it has a function, a denotational function, or a referential function, but it also has a social function. It has the function of drawing a line between two groups and characterizing one group as misunderstanding things and another group as understanding things. So, you can study systematically, you can follow through a transcript or a conversation. When does he use we? And when he uses we, who does he mean? Does he mean all of us in the room? Does he mean just the two of us? Does he mean everybody? Who does he mean? And by following that pronoun and the they that's opposed to it, you can figure out what kind of relationships are being created in this piece of discourse. So again, it's a connection between a systematic use of pronouns in this case and some social effect, some social action, which is dividing off one group of people from another group of people. The third way that language always functions is to connect itself to other pieces of language. So stories are an example of a big piece of discourse that hangs together as a package. So if I'm going to tell a story, I usually signal to you I'm going to tell a story. Let me tell you about what happened yesterday. Or my daughter did this, and my daughter and I went to New York, and I'm telling you, I want to tell you a story. Give me a little bit of space, don't interrupt me, let me talk a little bit about this story I'm going to tell you. Different people tell stories differently. So in American schools, we are taught to tell stories that have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and connections in between the pieces. So I tell you, here's what I'm talking about, here's how this piece connects to that piece, here's how this piece connects to the next piece, and often at the end you sort of wrap it up. You kind of tell people why you told them the story, you give them the moral of the story or the point of the story. You're more explicit. So in school we're taught to tell stories like that. There are some communities, some cultures where people don't tell stories like that. They tell stories like poems. They're more impressionistic, where you get a scene, they tell you a scene, and then they tell you another scene, but there's no connection between them. I was outside with my grandmother the other day, and it was really cold. And we were in the mall with my brothers and sisters, and we were looking for, well, what does the outside, what does the cold have to do with the mall? What's the relationship between the weather and the shopping you were doing? If I show you a poem, and the poem just has one stanza that describes one scene, and another stanza that describes another scene, and you ask me, well, why didn't the poet give an explanation? Why isn't there an explanation of what that has to do with that? You'll say to me, that's not what a poem does. I mean, poems are supposed to be impressions. They're not supposed to have instructions, right? The poem doesn't have a paragraph at the bottom that says, here's why I put these two things together. It doesn't have an account of it. It just has this scene and that scene, this stanza and that stanza. There are some people who tell stories that way. In other words, they'll just tell one piece, and then they'll tell another piece, and they won't tell you why these two things connect. It's a different way of putting a piece of discourse together. In schools, often teachers who tell stories the typical way, if they have a child who tells a story the second way, they'll conclude there's something wrong. In other words, this child isn't so intelligent, this child doesn't understand how to tell a story, there's something wrong with this child. But really what's happening is the child just learned to tell stories differently. It's a different style, or a different way of packaging a narrative. So, that's a discourse analysis. You study how is it that people tell stories, you study what are the structures or the typical patterns that people use when they tell a story, and then you study how different kinds of people, different groups of people tend to tell them differently and thereby misunderstand each other. So those are three examples of ways that you would do discourse analysis. You would take a pattern in the way that the language is used, like the systematic use of pronouns, we and they, or the different ways of telling stories, either with lots of transitions and morals or not. You would analyze how it is that the language is used systematically, and then you would study how that accomplishes social action, how it divides one group of people from another, how it makes one group of people who talk one way seem less intelligent, less successful, less educated than another group of people. So you would connect the systematic analysis of how language is used to an analysis of how the social actions work. Okay. Again, this? Steve? Okay? Okay, so when I say connect linguistic signs with its social functions, that's what I mean. Look at a pattern of linguistic signs and connect them with the kinds of social functions, social actions, social identities, social groups that are accomplished or positioned through that kind of discourse, through those patterns of signs. 3 different kinds of patterns: descriptive ones, denotational ones, relational ones, establishing relationships, and textual ones, ones that involve how pieces of language are positioned with respect to each other. So those are 3 different kinds of functions that language has. And you want to, in discourse analysis, you could study any one of those, or more than one. But those are 3 different dimensions that you should always keep in mind or look at. Okay, so the next distinction is a distinction between what is said and what is done. Anytime you speak, you always say something. And you always say it in a context of speaking. So right now I'm talking to you, and I'm talking to you about discourse analysis. And if somebody was doing a discourse analysis of this event, they would have to describe what it is I'm saying. I'm talking about linguistic signs and social actions and textual patterns and all those things I'm talking about. But I'm also doing it in a context where I'm talking to you, and we're all sitting here together in an event. So discourse analysis always has to take into account both of those things. You can't study just what people say, because you have to understand the context or the event within which they say it. So you have to study the event of narration. We call it the narrating event, or the event of speaking. Here, the event of speaking is me talking to all of you. The narrated event, the content that I speak, is talking about discourse analysis. And I'll give you examples of how discourse analysis is interesting when you talk about relationships across what is said and what's happening in the larger event of speaking. In order to understand what people are saying, you always have to understand something about the larger context inside which they say it. That's the connection between the discourse and the social actions that are accomplished through that discourse. So content analysis, for example, is about studying what is said, what's inside the box of what I say. But content analysis isn't about the event, the interaction, the social context within which I say that stuff. So a content analysis can be useful, but it doesn't take into account the important fact that there is this larger social context that I'm speaking in. And we need to understand the relationship between those two things, between what I say and what I do, between what I'm describing and the event within which, inside which I'm describing it. So I'll give you examples, but it's very important to keep in mind these basic distinctions. You want to look for what's being said, the relationships being established, and the text or the linkages across different signs. And you always want to look at what's said and the context inside which it's being said. These are 2 different realms that you always have to keep in mind. So the purpose of doing this kind of discourse analysis is which functions are being accomplished, in other words, what's being done, what's happening here as I'm speaking to you, and how is it being done. Those are the 2 goals. So if we are talking, the 2 of us, about Donald Trump and how he's wonderful, and how all the rest of you are fools or idiots for not seeing how wonderful he is, then what's happening is that there's a social function. We are excluding you, we're positioning you as different from us, as less intelligent, as less worthwhile, and that's all a type of social action. And maybe you don't do this in Spain. And in Spain, everybody just tells the truth and you never establish relationships when you talk to other people. No? So anytime people talk, they're doing stuff like that. They're positioning themselves as one kind of person or another, and they're positioning other people as different kinds of people. And so in discourse analysis, the job is to figure out what are they doing here, what's happening here, what are people doing with and to each other, and then how, what evidence can I give in the language itself that that's really what's happening. So if we're pretending that you guys are all unintelligent and uninformed and silly because you don't see the beauty of Donald Trump, then we have to figure out how. What did we say to each other? What did we say to you that carried that message, that established that message? So that's the job of discourse analysis, is to find the cues or the signs or the patterns that support your interpretation that this is really what's happening, as opposed to something else. And so I spend a lot of my time studying classroom discourse, educational discourse, to try to figure out how it is that students are positioned. Examples of that as we go along. Okay, so does everybody understand the basic stuff? That first slide was about the basic distinctions to do this kind of analysis. Everybody's okay? No questions, no problems? Nobody's angry or upset with me yet? No? You'll tell me, right? So my strategy for doing this is we want to look for certain kinds of cues or signs or pieces of evidence. You can't interpret discourse in one shot, in one go, or one pass. People would like a rule book. Everybody would like a rule book that says, if they say this, they mean that. It would be nice to have a rule book. So we would say that if we are excluding you and treating you like silly people, then we'd like to have a rule book that says, well, if he says this, it means that he's treating us like silly people. He's treating us like idiots. The problem is that language doesn't work that way. There is no rule book that says that every time I say this, I mean that. Because I can say something and mean multiple things by it. And so it's too bad. Discourse analysis would be easy if there were a rule book, because then you just take your transcript and you look at the rule book like a dictionary and you figure out what everything means. But you can't do that. It's not possible. Because I can say the same thing and mean multiple different kinds of things, accomplish multiple different kinds of actions. Because, for instance, I can be making a joke, you know. In English, they used to say, your mother wears army boots. And your mother wears army boots. What is that? Is it an insult? I mean, it's talking about your mother, and if you talk about somebody's mother, sometimes you're insulting them. But you're saying she wears army boots. I mean, it's a silly thing to say. Like, your mother wears army boots? What are you talking about, your mother wears army boots? So it could be an insult, but it could be a joke. I mean, only a stupid person would say such a thing, so you must think, it must be a joke. He must be joking with me. That if he really wanted to insult me, he'd say something worse about my mother, right? He wouldn't talk about army boots. He would talk about something else. So it could be a joke, could be an insult. It could be that this is something that people used to say in the United States 50 years ago, 80 years ago, people would say things like that. So it could be that I'm trying to pretend like I lived 50 years ago, like I talk the way people used to talk a long time ago. We call that an anachronism in English. It could be that I'm positioning myself as some person who lives in the past or who's really fond of that historical period. I really like World War II, and so I talk about army boots because people talked about that stuff back then. So we can't create a rule book that says, every time he says, your mother wears army boots, he's insulting me. We can't, because it could be a joke, as well as it could be an insult, or it could be me showing off my historical knowledge of the way idioms were used in America during World War II. It could be several different things. So the way we do discourse analysis is we first look for signs or cues or words or phrases that seem relevant, that seem interesting, that seem important. And once we pick them out, then we have to go and interpret, in this case, what do these words or phrases or signs mean? Because in different cases, they'll mean different things. So we go through and we look at certain sorts of patterns. So I'm doing this because we circle them, you know, or you would use colored markers to mark different kinds. You would go through your transcript and pick out stuff that could be important. But you never know exactly what's important in your particular case. Because again, there's not a rule book that says, every time he says your mother, he's insulting you. Because sometimes I talk about your mother, I really like the dress your mother's wearing today. Or your mother raised you wonderfully, you're such a well-educated person. So I can say your mother and not be insulting. So what you do is you circle your mother because sometimes your mother does mean there's an insult happening. You circle it, but you don't know at first whether it's important. It could be just not important at all in your particular case. So 2 steps of an analysis. First, you go through and you pick out things that might be important. And second, you go back and you figure out which kinds of patterns are in fact important in this case, on this particular piece of data that I'm looking at. And I'll give you various examples of how it is that works. I have several kinds of cues. So what kinds of signs or words do you pay attention to when you are going through and looking through your transcript for important things? So I have several suggestions here. You never know, in any given case, the piece, the sign, or word that's most important might be something you don't expect. So there's no procedure where we can say you will always find the crucial signs if you do this. There is no procedure like that, because in particular cases, unexpected things could be important. But there are certain kinds of words or signs that are very often important. And so I've listed some of them up here. So a metapragmatic verb is a verb of speaking, for example. So to say, to tell, to expostulate, to curse, those are all metapragmatic verbs. They're verbs that describe an act of speaking. When you quote another person, you often are able to quote what they say and use a verb that describes the event of speaking. So, John yelled at me yesterday. Yell is a metapragmatic verb. Now in English, yell is a relatively strong verb. That to yell at somebody means that they spoke harshly to you. That there was something pretty harsh in what they said or did. So if I say John yelled at me, I'm telling you something about what I think about John. I'm describing something. I'm saying there was an event in which John said stuff to me and raised his voice, but I'm also telling you what I think about him. He's the kind of person who yells. Another way to say it is, if you are quoting another speaker, if you have the chance to tell a story about what John did to you yesterday, you are in a position of power, because you can choose the words that describe what it is that John did. So I could have said, John said such and such to me. John said I was late. John said I was late yesterday. John told me I was late yesterday. That's relatively neutral. John screamed at me yesterday. John was furious at me yesterday. He yelled at me because I was late. Those are different ways of describing the same event. John told me I was late. John told me I should have come 5 minutes earlier. It's different to say John yelled at me. John screamed at me at the top of his lungs that I was a horrible person because I showed up late. So when I describe what John said, I have the power to present him as a certain kind of person. John yelled at me and lost control of himself and screamed up and down. That gives you a picture of John as a person who's difficult, right? A person you wouldn't want to meet. But if I just say, John told me that I was late, John pointed out that I was late yesterday, you would meet John, you wouldn't be afraid of him, it would be okay. So one kind of cue or pattern or sign that you want to pay special attention to is verbs of speaking and quotation. So anytime in a transcript somebody says, John told, screamed, yelled, expostulated, whatever your favorite verb is, anytime somebody says something like that, you want to look carefully at it. Not because it's always important, but because often it's important. Often it gives you information that's useful, because it's telling you, what does the speaker mean? What do I think about who John is? And how am I trying to present John to these people who are with me? There's a famous literary figure named Ring Lardner, an American, who in one of his stories he was describing his interaction with his father, and the one line he puts to describe his interaction with his father, how he and his father used to talk to each other. So in the text, the first thing is, shut up, is in quotes. Shut up, my father explained. So, shut up, my father explained. And so how do you say? Cállate, mi padre me explicó, something like that. There's a contrast between explain and shut up, right? That to explain means to give you an account and be reasoned like a scientist. You would give a description and explain. Shut up is not an explanation. Shut up is rude, right? Shut up is telling somebody to shut up. So shut up, my father explained. It's a very short quote, but it tells you a lot about his father. His father is the kind of person who thought he was explaining things, who pretended he was explaining, who pretended he was being rational, but really he was just telling his kid to shut up. So that short expression captures a lot about the kind of person his father is, right? It's not just my father was a nasty loudmouth who yelled at me. He's communicating that to you. But it's also he was a nasty loudmouth who yelled at me all the time, and he pretended that he was explaining things to me. He pretended he was being very mature and nice and well-educated, but really he wasn't, because he said stuff like, shut up to me all the time. So, analyzing discourse, you want to notice a pattern like that, that when you are able to quote a character as saying something, there's often a lot of information in there about what's going on, about what kind of person that character is. And there's also information about the speaker, in this case about Ring Lardner, who wrote that. He tells you something about himself. He's the kind of person who would make that kind of an observation. Okay, so that's an example of the kind of signs or words or expressions you want to attend to as you go through your discourse the first time, because they could be important. Not always important, but could be. So these are the things I want to illustrate today. The basic question in discourse analysis, I said, is always what's going on, what's happening here in this piece of discourse, and what signs, what words or expressions communicate that. What are the words or expressions that are doing the work of creating whatever's going on? And so the way you do that is you study how particular signs point to relevant aspects of context. And it's going to be easier to do this by giving you an example or two. So why don't we switch to the handout? Could you switch it for me? You guys have a handout, right? That you were given on the Moodle platform. And I don't know if you have it on your computers or if you have a paper copy of it, but we'll project it up there too. So if you don't have it in front of you, you can see it. Except you can do it in Spanish if you want, as a Spanish version of the book. So I think this is wrong. This should be colaterales, or should it be colateral?
Colaterales.
Colaterales. Okay. Daños colaterales, collateral damages, is an idiom in English. So daños colaterales means when the Army or the Air Force tries to go after some other army, some soldiers, and it kills civilians by accident. So collateral damage means yesterday this person who is speaking is in the Pentagon. So in the Pentagon they have a room where they meet the press. So you have reporters from various newspapers and televisions there. And someone from the Pentagon stands up and says, here's what happened yesterday. Yesterday, we have this war going on in Iraq. Yesterday, we did some bombing, and there were some collateral damages. So what that means, there was some collateral damage, is yesterday, we killed some civilians. That's what it means. They killed civilians by accident. They didn't mean to kill the civilians, but they did. So this is what's said. So this is a piece of discourse. This is one little piece of discourse. It's one clause that happened in this session. So it's someone who works for the U.S. military, for the U.S. Army, who's talking to a bunch of reporters out there in the room and saying there was some collateral damage. So different things you need to see here. That this is a distinction between what I call the narrated event. This is the event that's happening in the room. There's a speaker, and there's the members of the media, of the press, from the newspapers and the television stations out there. So that's an interactional event. She's talking, they're listening. This is what happens in the event. And this is what's actually said. So what she says is, there was some collateral damage yesterday. And what that means, the first thing you have to do is understand what it means. What does that mean? What's she describing? First thing language does is language always says something. It describes something. So in order to understand that, you have to know this idiom. You have to know that this idiom means dead civilians. That's the first thing you have to know. But language always does something else, right? Language always establishes relationships between people. And so, in this case, by using that expression, collateral damage, by saying that, she's positioning herself, because only certain kinds of people say that. For instance, I don't say that. If I'm talking to any of you, yesterday there was some collateral damage. I don't say that. I would say there were some dead civilians, or the army killed somebody yesterday. So to use the expression identifies you as a kind of person, because only a certain kind of person says that. In the United States, there's a publication, there's a magazine, it's called Soldier of Fortune magazine. Soldier of Fortune magazine is read by people who are, we call them gun nuts. They're military aficionados, they're people who really like guns, and they really like the army, and they have lots of guns in their houses, and they like to go out and shoot things. And so, Soldier of Fortune magazine. So people like that, who read Soldier of Fortune magazine, they say collateral damage. If you say collateral damage, that it could be somebody who's in the army, or it could be somebody who's a politician, or it could be somebody who reads Soldier of Fortune magazine. Those are the kinds of people who use that expression. And if any one of you stopped me in the hall and said, yes, hey, I hear there was collateral damage yesterday, I would say, you know, do you read Soldier of Fortune magazine, or are you in the army and I didn't know it? Because I wouldn't expect any of you to talk like that. So, this briefer, it's not really a surprise that she's using an expression like this, because she works for the army, she works for the military. Out here, that there are critics who would never use this expression. That is, there are people who are critical of the U.S. Army who would never talk like that, because only the wrong kind of people talk like that. And then there are people from the military and people who read Soldier of Fortune magazine, people who like the army, who would use an expression like that. So you could imagine a case in which somebody used that expression, but she was being ironic. So let's say, when she said this, that she did this. She said, there was some collateral damage, and she rolled her eyes like this. Collateral damage. That's another sign, right? It's a nonverbal sign, but it's a sign. So if she said collateral damage, then you would start asking yourself, why didn't she do that? Like, why didn't she do this when she was saying collateral damage? It gives you a cue that maybe she doesn't really mean it, right? Maybe she's a little uncomfortable with that expression, because maybe she doesn't like the fact that there are dead civilians. Maybe she needs this job because she has to pay her bills, but she really wishes that she didn't have to be associated with the army because it's killing civilians. And so, in that case, she's using collateral damage, but she's doing it ironically. She's not really saying it herself. She's saying, I know I'm supposed to say this, I have to say it this way. If I say, there are some dead, like, we killed some civilians yesterday, if she says that, she's going to lose her job, right? So she has to say collateral damage. But your job as a discourse analyst is to try to figure out, did she really mean it? Like, did she say collateral damage because she's the kind of person who says that, because she's associated with the military? Or did she say it because she had to, but really she is not happy having to talk like this? She's not happy having to work in this kind of a job? So that's a question where we can't answer it from one utterance. We don't know. We have to see what else she says in order to figure that out. But that's how you do discourse analysis. You look for patterns of signs. If it's just someone who works for the Pentagon saying there was some collateral damage yesterday, that's probably not controversial or interesting. She probably talks like that because they all talk like that in the Pentagon. But if she gives you some other cue that maybe she doesn't really mean it, then you have to dig deeper. You have to look further to try to see what other patterns might be going on there. So, this is the structure of how we're going to go after discourse analysis. We're going to try to figure out what are people saying, and then we're going to try to figure out how does that connect to the larger society, plus the people in the event that is being analyzed. And we're going to look for specific pieces of discourse, specific signs or words or phrases and we're going to try to figure out what do those tell us about what's really being done. So in this case, is she in a straightforward way saying collateral damage because people like her talk like that? Or is she being ironic and trying to distance herself from it? And that question requires you to look at specific pieces. Okay, so why don't we go on to the next piece of this handout. So here's an example. I've got it in English, and I got it in Spanish too. So the next page is in Spanish. So let me tell you a little bit about this. So this is a piece of transcript from a classroom conversation. What you need to know about it is you need to know it's 9th grade, so they're 14 years old. It's an English and history class, so it's a class where the English teacher who teaches English literature and the history teacher are teaching together with a group of students. And in this particular case, they're talking about Rome, about ancient Rome. So the text that they're talking about is, it's called Cicero's letter to Atticus. So back in Rome, when Caesar was the emperor, you know, there was a group of people who tried to kill Caesar, right? There was Cassius and Brutus ended up killing Caesar. So Caesar was the emperor, and Cassius and Brutus were plotting to kill him, to overthrow him. And it turns out that Cicero was alive at the same time. And Cicero had a problem. The problem was he learned about the plot to kill Caesar, and he had to decide. Am I going to tell Caesar? He could have told Caesar, there's a plot, they're going to kill you, and then Caesar would have liked him, right? Then he would have gotten something from the emperor. Or he could have joined the plotters. He could have gone to Cassius and Brutus and said, that Caesar's a bad guy, I'm going to help you kill him. Or what he in fact did, apparently, was he ran away, he left Rome while this was all happening, so he wouldn't get blamed either way. So Cicero had a problem he had to deal with, and the letter to Atticus describes it. He basically says to his friend, he says, I just learned about this plot to kill Caesar, and I really don't know what to do. Should I tell Caesar? Should I join the plotters? Should I just hide? What should I do? That's what the letter says. It's a short letter. So the students have read this, and what happens in this piece is the teachers are trying to help the students understand what it was like. You know, what is Cicero saying? Why does he feel conflicted? What is Cicero's problem? So they want the students to understand that better. And in order to do it, the teacher gives an example. He basically says, okay, he talks to Maurice and he says, Maurice, you're just like Cicero. Now let's pretend that I'm a dictator, I'm a tyrant, I'm an emperor. Mr. Smith, the teacher, says this. Let's pretend that I'm the emperor, I'm the dictator. And let's pretend that there are a few students in the classroom here who are planning to kill me. He says here, they're planning to push me down the stairs. So there are a few students who are planning to push me down the stairs after class. Because I'm a dictator, I'm a tyrant, I'm nasty. In fact, Mr. Smith is kind of nasty. And I don't think that anyone is planning to push him down the stairs, but he was kind of nasty. And so he says to Maurice, okay, so there are these kids over here, they're planning to push me down the stairs after class. And you, Maurice, you know about this. And so, what are you going to do? Are you going to tell me, you know, and then I'll reward you, you know, I'll give you an A for the class? Or are you going to join them and help push me down the stairs? Or what are you going to do? So that's the example that he gives. So I want you guys to help me out. We have some of these pieces of paper here. So we have blank diagrams that I want you to do two things for me. So this diagram just has, it's just like that diagram I showed, except it has two boxes in it. So basically what we need to have here is we need to have, within each of these boxes, you guys need to write down who are the characters and what's going on in this piece of discourse that might be important to understanding the social actions that are happening. So I have one here that's called example. There's one box that's a description of the example. The example is Mr. Smith imagining that he's like a tyrant and that Maurice is trying to figure out what to do. That's the example. The text is just Cicero's letter to Atticus. Who are the characters in the text? And then out here is the space for the classroom itself. Mr. Smith, there's another teacher, her name is Mrs. Bailey, and all the students are sitting in the classroom. So that's what's going on out here. So you can use this sheet in order to draw yourself a picture of what's happening in these three different domains, or these three different realms. And what you want to do with the text is you want to go through that text and figure out which of the words or the signs that are communicating something important. In other words, what are the clues to what might be happening? What clues are in that discourse that could turn out to be important for us to understand what's Mr. Smith doing, how is he positioning himself, how is he positioning Maurice, what kind of people are they presenting themselves as? Now in this little example, we're not going to get any final answers, because we're going to need more data. We're going to have to look further in the conversation to get definite answers. But I want you just to take a few minutes and start. Just look at this piece of text, see what kinds of patterns you see, and then we'll talk about it and we'll go on to another piece of data from the same conversation. Okay? And if you have questions, you can come up and talk to me, and we'll just take a few minutes and do this.
Bueno, no,